When Kit Carson was still a teenager, he ventured west looking to escape the drudgery of civilization. And in the years to come, he'd find all the excitement a youngster could hope for in the life of a mountain man. For well over a decade, Carson would embark on a series of fur trapping expeditions, from New Mexico and Arizona all the way up into present-day Montana and as far west as California. According to Carson, these were the happiest days of his life, there in the mountains, far from the habitations of civilized men, with no other food than that which he could procure with his rifle. But the good times never last forever. By the early 1840s, the beaver trade was played out, and he soon found himself embarking on a brand new career. That as a guide for an up-and-coming explorer named John C. Fremont. And it was this partnership that would elevate both men to the status of living legends. What was life like for Kit Carson after the fur trade? Who exactly was this John C. Fremont guy? Why'd they call him the Pathfinder? And how much of Fremont's success stemmed from his association with Kit Carson? We're going to discuss all of this and more, including Fremont's various expeditions, Carson's family life, and a few massacres that, to this day, largely remain forgotten. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. By the winter of 1841, Kit Carson was forced to hang up his traps. In addition to an economic depression back east, he and his fellow mountain men were also contending with plummeting fur prices, as hat manufacturers took to using silk rather than beaver felt. And if that ain't bad enough, Carson had recently been left a widower following the death of his Arapaho wife, Singing Grass, a demise that was most likely brought on by a postpartum infection. Unfortunately, the exact dates are elusive, but it's thought that Kit and Singing Grass were married sometime in the late 1830s. She bore Carson 2 healthy daughters, but would sadly pass away either in 1839 or 1840. In other words, by 1841, the then 32-year-old Kit Carson was a single father to 2 young girls and desperately trying to adapt to an ever-changing world. Luckily, he was able to find employment as a hunter down at Bent's Fort, not far from present-day La Junta, Colorado. And as fate would have it, it's there where Kit would meet his second wife, a Cheyenne whose name roughly translated to Making Out Road. Now, unlike his previous marriage, this was not a happy union. Hell, just a couple of months after tying the knot, Kit returned home only to find that his new bride had tossed all of his belongings from her lodge, which was basically the Cheyenne way of finalizing a divorce. According to historian David Lavender, quote, "The girl was spoiled. She had put most of the Cheyenne bachelors and half of the white men at the fort in a slow burn, and they showered her with presents. Now that she was married, she expected Kit to keep her an expensive foo-for-all. She ignored her household chores and neglected little Adeline." End quote. Adeline, of course, was Carson's oldest daughter. Now, in Making Out Road's defense, we never do get to hear her side of the story. However, at least one source I've found states that after ditching Carson, she went on to marry and divorce several other men, both white and Native American. If I'm not mistaken, she even hooked up with the notorious James Beckworth. So who knows, maybe Making Out Road was a tad bit on the difficult side, or maybe she just refused to settle. Luckily for Carson, he'd find true love the following year with a young girl named Josefa Jaramillo, the 14-year-old daughter of a prominent Taos family who also just so happened to be the sister-in-law of Kit's friend and employer, Charles Bent. And yeah, you heard that right. She was only 14 years old. You know, while I do realize that people occasionally got hitched much younger back in those old days, it's still jarring to think of someone that damn young getting married. Nevertheless, this relationship would stick, and the two remained together until Josefa's death over 25 years later. And just to give you an idea of Josefa's charm, a visitor to the Carson home in 1846 would describe her beauty as the heartbreaking kind, such as would lead a man with the glance of an eye to risk his life for just one smile. And you got to admit, the creepiness of her age aside, that right there is one hell of a good line. I don't know about you, but I definitely plan on using it myself in the very near future. And by the way, as happy as this marriage seems to have been, it's worth pointing out that Carson was almost continuously on the move. Despite being together for a quarter of a century, he and Josefa would really only consistently live with one another for like a total of around 6 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Lovebirds would make things official, Kit decided to travel back east for the first time since running away as a teenager. Not only did Carson hope to visit his family, but he also wanted to give Adeline the opportunity for a decent education, something that he himself had never received. When the pair arrived in the town of Westport, Kit purchased a few brand new outfits for Adeline, replacing her traditional Arapaho attire. According to the daughter of a local tavern owner, Carson brought his little girl to be educated. She came to us dressed in buckskin and left dressed in the finest goods that could be bought on the border. From there, they pushed another 100 miles east to Franklin, where Kit discovered that his childhood home had been washed away in a flood. And even worse, he learned that his mother, Rebecca, had passed away the previous year. He was still able to find some of his remaining family, though, one of whom, a cousin Thomas, described Kit as a wild, uncouth boy who married, of all things, an Indian squaw and had a little half-breed girl. Why I never. I did add in that why I never part at the end, but something tells me old bitch-made Thomas never said any such thing to Carson's face. Thankfully, the rest of the family proved far more welcoming, and Carson was able to leave Adeline in their care. And much like he had hoped, in the years to come, she would receive a pretty decent education, attending an all-girls seminary before returning west. Speaking of returning west, by the time Carson handed off Adeline to his kinfolks, he was about ready to head back his own self, having already gotten his fill of so-called civilization. Quote, "It had been a long time since I had been amongst civilized people. I arrived at the States, went and saw my friends and acquaintances, and then took a trip to St. Louis, remained a few days, and was tired of remaining in the settlements." End quote. Now, unfortunately, while Kit was away in Missouri, tragedy struck once again. His youngest daughter, who, if I'm not mistaken, had been left in the care of the Bent family, either in Taos or Bent's Fort, was scalded to death when she fell into a vat of boiling soap tallow, something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. So far as I know, there's not a record of Carson's reaction to this horrible news, but needless to say, he weren't in no hurry to return home. Instead, he caught a steamer bound for the upper Missouri and became acquainted with a fellow passenger, a guy by the name of John Charles Fremont. And despite Carson's recent loss and the fact that he and Fremont were almost complete opposites personality-wise, they were still able to strike up a quick friendship. Indeed, the lives of both men would be dramatically intertwined for years to come. Or, as historian David Roberts put it, no chance meeting in the long history of the American West would more doings of high consequence depend. Now, Fremont was a topographer by trade, and while he was both intelligent and capable, he was also somewhat of a loose cannon. Got kicked out of college for incorrigible negligence, had a reputation of being a womanizer, and frankly, the man was just a tad bit of a drama queen. To be honest, John Fremont really just had one thing in his favor, his wife, Jessie, who just so happened to be the daughter of powerful U.S. Senator Thomas Benton. And thanks to Benton's lobbying behind the scenes, John C. Fremont was able to land a series of government assignments exploring the West. All he needed now was a good scout, someone who knew the lay of the land, how and where to cross rivers and mountains, and preferably someone that could see to it they kept their scalps. And well, I guess old John Fremont quickly deduced that Carson was the right man for the job. Now, Fremont's first expedition would be to map out the Oregon Trail from Missouri all the way to the South Pass in present-day Wyoming. They got their start on August 12, 1842, with Carson in the lead, and it pretty much went off without a hitch. The weather was decent, there were no issues with the hostiles, and nobody got killed or otherwise maimed. Not only that, but Fremont's maps and his account of the country that they explored proved widely popular back east, pretty much guaranteeing a second expedition the following year. In the meantime, Carson would take leave of Fremont at Fort Laramie that September, and it was in February of 1843 when he finally made things official with his lady love, Josefa. Other than that, we don't really know what Carson was up to for the early part of the year. He himself would only state that he went to Bent's Fort, so I guess it's possible he simply resumed his job as a hunter. Whatever the case, he would reunite with Fremont later on that summer for another expedition, one whose primary goal would be to map out the second half of the Oregon Trail from Wyoming all the way to the Willamette Valley. And yeah, once again, Carson was serving as a guide. Along the way, they'd make a detour and explore the northern part of the Great Salt Lake before pushing north into present-day Idaho, following the Snake River to the Columbia and the Columbia all the way into Oregon. But why stop there, right? Rather than returning home, Fremont decided to push south and do a little air quotes exploring around the western portion of the Great Basin, an arid region lying between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. And I say air quotes exploring, because while this was indeed an exploratory venture, Fremont was also a very strong adherent to the idea of manifest destiny, or in other words, the belief that white Americans were divinely ordained to settle the entire continent of North America, a passion made all that more intense by the influence of his father-in-law, Senator Benton. Hell, according to biographer Hampton Sides, more than anyone else in Washington, more than President Polk even, Tom Benton was the face and voice of manifest destiny. So yeah, while these westward expeditions were proven to be extremely valuable as far as the topographical research was concerned, they were also scoping out land that could potentially fall into the hands of the United States, which pretty much explains Fremont's next move. Rather than turn east and return home, he instead had Carson lead the men west into California. And this really does show just how ambitious Fremont was. Not only was this maneuver illegal as hell, after all, California was officially owned by Mexico, but it was also in the dead of winter. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but crossing the Sierras during the wintertime doesn't always work out all that well. Don't take my word for it though, just ask the Donner Party. Even the local natives refused to help, saying that the passage through the mountains would be next to impossible. But Carson proved otherwise. By the end of February, Kit had successfully led the men through a pass which still bears his name to this day, Carson's Pass, just a few miles east of where the town of Kirkwood, California now stands. After a brief respite at Sutter's Fort, the explorers would head south through California's Central Valley, exploring and mapping as they went. He also put to rest the idea of a fabled Buenaventura River connecting the Great Basin with the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't until later on that spring that Fremont had the men turn east and head across the Mojave Desert, homeward bound. It was during this crossing in late April of 1844 that they came upon an older Mexican gentleman and his son, the lone survivors of an Indian attack. Not only were their companions killed, but the natives had made off with around 30 head of their horses. Now, if there's one thing I know about Kit Carson, it's that he wasn't all that big on tolerating horse theft. That being the case, he and a companion, fellow fur trapper Alex Godey, volunteered to track the ne'er-do-wells down. 2 days later, they came upon the thieves at dawn. It was 2 against 30, but Carson and Alex had the benefit of catching the hostiles unaware. They charged the camp, managed to kill 2 before the rest of them scattered. And what's more, they were also able to retrieve most of the stolen horses. At least the ones that hadn't already been butchered for food. The following day, Fremont was startled to hear a war whoop, only to then spy Carson and Godey returning triumphantly, stolen horses in tow, and 2 scalps dangling from Godey's rifle. By the 2nd of July, they had reached Bent's Fort, and by that August, Fremont arrived back in Washington, D.C. to a hero's welcome. He was lauded by President Tyler for gallantry and meritorious service, and even promoted to the rank of captain. Once again, Fremont's findings were published for the general public, and the young explorer grew so popular that folks began tossing around his name as a potential candidate for the Oval Office. It's also at this point that Fremont was bestowed with the endearing nickname of the Pathfinder, a descriptor that, according to at least one biographer, was more suited for Carson than it was for Fremont. Per Hampton Sides, quote, "The special thing that Carson had couldn't be boiled down to any one skill. It was a panoply of talents. He was a fine hunter, an adroit horseman, an excellent shot. He was shrewd as a negotiator. He knew how to select a good campsite and could set it up or strike it in minutes. He knew what to do when a horse foundered. He could dress and cure meat and was a fair cook. Out of necessity, he was also a passable gunsmith, blacksmith, liveryman, angler, forager, farrier, wheelwright, mountain climber, and a decent paddler by raft or canoe. As a tracker, he was unequaled. He knew from experience how to read the watersheds, where to find grazing grass, and what to do when encountering a grizzly. He could locate water in the driest arroyo. In a crisis, he knew little tricks for staving off thirst, such as opening the fruit of a cactus or clipping a mule's ear and drinking its blood. He had a landscape painter's eye and a cautious ear and astute judgment about people and situations. He knew how to make smoke signals. He knew all about hitches and rope knots. He knew how to make a good set of snowshoes. He knew how to tan hides with a gluttonous emulsion made from the brains of the animal. He knew how to cache food and hides in the ground to prevent theft and spoilage. He knew how to break a mustang. He knew which species of wood would burn well and how to split the logs on the grain, even when an axe was not handy. These were important skills, all of them, though they were hard to measure and quantify. but in the right person, a person who's also cheerful on the trail that he already knew well, who had a few jokes up his sleeve and possessed absolute honesty, they were invaluable. Fremont's nickname, the Pathfinder, was a misnomer several times over, for it was Carson, not Fremont, who usually found the path. And often as not, he was merely retracing trails that had already been trod by trappers, Indians, or Spanish explorers. In Cooper's Leather Stock and Tell series, the main protagonist, Natty Bumppo, aka Hawkeye, aka the Pathfinder, wears buckskins, lives with the Indians, and follows their ways. It was Carson, not Fremont, who actually lived a life that resembled Cooper's hero. End quote, and well said, Mr. Sides. With all that in mind, I do want to point out that Fremont didn't hoard all the glory for himself. He spoke very glowingly of Carson, describing the guide as self-sacrificing and a man of great courage. Said the Kit was the finest horseman he had ever seen, and he wrote in great detail of that epic battle there in the desert between Kit and the indigenous horse thieves. Simply put, this expedition turned both Fremont and Carson into celebrities back east. A fame that would only continue to grow with a third, much more ambitious expedition in 1845. If you'll recall, a few minutes ago we spoke of manifest destiny, and once again I'd like to quote Carson biographer Hampton Sides. To call any of Fremont's expeditions purely scientific, as he often did, would be disingenuous. Ulterior motives lurked behind nearly all of his movements in the West. Overtly or not, his larger purpose was to advance the cause of American immigration, American expansion, and American hemispheric hegemony, which is to say he was carrying out Senator Thomas Benton's vision like a good and dutiful son-in-law. And yeah, as it turns out, this third expedition would prove to be the least scientific of them all. While Fremont was indeed returning to California, he was hoping to do so as a conqueror as opposed to a mere topographer. Now, it's worth mentioning that California, or Alta California, as it was known back in those days, was first established in 1804 as a province of Spain. And then just a few years later, it became a territory of Mexico following the Mexican War of Independence. By the 1840s, most of California's Hispanic residents lived along the coast, near the various missions, whereas the American immigrants had been settling further north in the Sacramento Valley. And, well, let's just say that neither group was all that pleased with the powers that be down in Mexico. The Californios, or native-born Hispanics, felt neglected by the Mexican government, and by 1845, there were open discussions among both them and the whites as to whether or not California should remain with Mexico, become its own republic, or even possibly be annexed by the United States or Great Britain. The idea of the British taking control of California was especially a very real threat in the minds of John C. Fremont and his daddy-in-law, Senator Benton. They both seemed convinced that California wouldn't remain in Mexico's hands for long, and were hoping to claim it for the United States before the bloody British could come stinking the joint up with their fish and chips and god-awful tea. As far as Kit Carson was concerned, I don't know that he ever shared his opinion on the matter one way or the other. Following that second expedition, he simply returned to his wife Josefa and started working on a ranch east of Taos. Quote, Dick Owens and I concluded that, as we had rambled enough, it would be advisable for us to go and settle on some good stream and make us a farm. End quote. But as it turns out, Carson had quite a bit of rambling yet to endure. Just as he and Dick began clearing land, they were paid a visit by one of Fremont's messengers. Not looking to miss out on an adventure, Kit almost immediately sold the ranch as he and Dick headed north to join up with Fremont for that third expedition. To quote historian David Roberts, Kit Carson would not return home for another 13 months, and when he did, it would be to spend a single night with Josefa before heading out again. The settled life would have to wait. Now, Fremont had departed St. Louis in June of 1845, over 70 men strong, with the official goal of mapping and exploring the eastern slope of the southern Rockies. At least that's how it looked on paper. Unofficially, it seemed that Fremont was carrying out a secret mission and had no intention whatsoever at stopping at the Rockies. Truth be told, just as soon as he and his party reached the Arkansas and were joined by Carson, they just kept on a-going, headed straight west for the Golden State. Full disclosure, it's still unknown to this day if Fremont was doing this on his own volition or, as I alluded to a moment ago, secret orders from the government. We also don't know if the other men of the party, Carson included, knew of Fremont's ultimate goal of conquering California. One has to wonder if Kit would have gone along with playing soldier had he known what he was in for. Then again, Kit was loyal to a fault, so who knows. I personally tend to think that he would have done pretty much whatever Fremont wanted. As you'll soon learn, another trend when it comes to Carson was his tendency to defer to those who he felt were his betters or superiors. Be that as it may, Carson was worth more than his weight in gold when it came to being a guide, and he would most certainly continue to prove his worth during this expedition. It was largely thanks to Kit that they were able to make it through a waterless desert intact, even after the local indigenous said it would be impossible. Sort of like the year before when they were crossing the Sierras in the dead of winter. And this time, when the snow finally began to fly, Carson had already delivered Fremont and the others safely to California's Sacramento Valley. In the weeks that followed, Fremont would travel around quite a bit and speak with the locals, almost all of whom were either American or British immigrants, just checking the political temperature while at the same time trying to build up a little goodwill. Eventually, they pushed southwest and set up camp outside of Monterey. Pathfinder even went so far as to meet with the Mexican authorities, including General Jose Castro, assuring him that his party was topographical in nature and posed no threat. Be that as it may, General Castro's mama didn't raise no fool, and it weren't long before he deduced there was something shady going on with Fremont. He'd soon issue the Americans an ultimatum: leave California or else. And rather than leave, Fremont instead moved his men east to the mountains, where he boldly began flying the American flag and preparing for an Alamo-like siege. He even wrote to the American consul there in Monterey saying, quote, "We have in no wise done wrong to the people or authorities of this country, and if we are hemmed in and assaulted, we will die every man of us, under the flag of our country." End quote, and hell yeah, brother. Turns out Fremont's bark was a little worse than his bite, though. As soon as General Castro began massing troops, old John C. came to his senses and ordered the men to pull out. They fled north, well past Sutter's Fort, and all the way to a place known as Lassen's Ranch, some 30 or so miles east of present-day Red Bluff, California. The initial plan was just to lay over for a few days, but Fremont and his party would end up spending damn near a month there. According to David Roberts, quote, "carrying on the pretense of his topographic survey while keeping his ear cocked for the sounds of gunfire emanating from Monterey." Unfortunately, it's during their stay there at Lassen's that Fremont and his men would also take part in a terrible massacre, one resulting in a death toll surpassing both Sand Creek and Wounded Knee. It seems that some American settlers came into Fremont's camp one day, claiming that there were 1,000 natives congregating nearby and making preparations to attack. They asked the Pathfinder to help drive them off, and Fremont agreed. One of the best accounts of what happens next comes from participant Thomas Martin. Quote, "At the foot of the low hills where the Sacramento River comes out of the mountains, on the left side of the river going up, we found the Indians to the number of 4,000 to 5,000 on a tongue of land between the bends of the river, having a war dance preparatory to attacking the settlers. Our advance guard of 36 came inside of them and immediately charged and poured a volley into them, killing 24. Then they rushed in with their sabers, the rest of the party coming up and charged in among them, and in less than 3 hours we had killed over 175 of them. Most of the Indians escaped into the neighboring mountains." End quote. Now, Carson would only claim there were 1,000 natives as opposed to 5,000, but I'm willing to bet both he and old Martin were just slightly exaggerating. Eyewitness Thomas Breckenridge had a much more realistic number of just 400, 250 of which were women and children. And according to Breckenridge, they killed somewhere between 120 to 150 of them. Quote, "They charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive." End quote. Another eyewitness, William Tustin, recalled how Fremont's men chased down the fleeing natives and tomahawked them to death, while at the same time men with rifles stood on the shore and gunned down any survivors who attempted to swim to safety. Tustin would also describe it as a slaughter, and even Kit Carson would call it a perfect butchery. Keep in mind that Fremont's party had not suffered a single casualty. They just rode in guns a-blazing and finished the job with their long knives and hatchets, without anybody receiving so much as a solitary scratch. Almost kind of makes you wonder how dangerous this gathering of the indigenous truly was. As of this recording, we do not know for sure what tribe this was, but experts have narrowed it down to either the Wintu, the Maidu, or the Yanas, all three of which were known to frequent the area at various times. According to Jim Johnston, an archaeologist for the Lassen National Forest, it's hard to tell which group it was. What the settlers saw was no doubt not a war dance. In March and April, the salmon run up the Sacramento River. That could explain the gathering. It was a big social occasion. There would have been dances. The Maidu used to have a spring ritual they called the bear dance. So yeah, not really a good look for either Fremont or Carson. I think Carson especially should have known better, considering he had spent his entire adult life around the Indians. I also find it curious how the explorers had recently fled from the Mexican militia, but yet they didn't hesitate to attack a much larger force of Native Americans, who most likely were just having a peaceful gathering. Even if no women and children were killed, which I highly doubt, they still had almost no motivation to attack this village, other than the word of some nervous farmers. But like I always say, life was cheap back in the Old West, and sadly this indiscriminate killing was far from over. Following this massacre, now known as the Sacramento River Massacre, Fremont and his party would push north yet again, this time all the way up into Oregon, where they'd camp out on the banks of Klamath Lake. Remember, we still don't know Fremont's ultimate purpose with this expedition. We can theorize that he was planning on conquering California, but at this point in time, nobody really knows. I'm not entirely sure he even knew what the hell he was doing. Most historians seem to think that the Pathfinder was simply biding his time and waiting on additional orders on how to proceed. Orders that apparently arrived on the evening of May 9th, 1846, with the sudden arrival of a tough-as-nails Marine by the name of Archibald Gillespie. Now, all you jarheads, listen up. This dude was not only the real deal, but his OPSEC was impeccable. Already a 12-year veteran of the Corps, Gillespie was sent by the Secretary of State with secret messages for the American consul in Monterey, Commodore John Sloat, who at that time was in command of the Pacific Fleet, and finally, Carson's boss, John C. Fremont. Gillespie left D.C. in October of 1845. Traveled to New York City, where he caught a steamer down to Veracruz. And from there, Lieutenant Gillespie worked his way east, across the mainland of Mexico, and caught a whaling ship to Hawaii, where he may or may not have caught a variety of venereal diseases. From Honolulu, he caught another vessel, an American man-of-war, which he took all the way to Monterey, at which point, coming ashore under the cover of a merchant, he relayed his secret messages to the consul and the commodore before heading out yet again, just trekking across the wilderness until he found Fremont and Carson there on Klamath Lake. We do not know what Gillespie's dispatch contained, believe it or not, but Fremont would later write that the information he delivered had, quote, absolved me from my duty as explorer, and I was left to my duty as an officer of the American Army with the future authoritative knowledge that to obtain possession of California was the chief object of the president, end quote. In other words, he, Kit Carson, and everybody else would soon be returning south to California with the aim of taking it over by force if necessary. And I say everybody else, but I should say almost everybody, because as it turns out, a few of their party would be buried right there in Oregon. Now, we will discuss the California invasion in full next week, including the Bear Flag Revolt, but there is something else that occurred there on the shores of Klamath Lake that I think deserves a mention. Sadly, this would be the location of yet another massacre. When the so-called explorers first arrived, they had made contact with the Klamath tribe at the site of present-day Klamath Falls. They were able to trade for dried fish, but according to Fremont, our arrival took them, the Klamath, by surprise. And although they received us with apparent friendship, there was no warmth in it, but a shyness which came naturally from their habit of hostility. Now, at some point, Fremont had split up his command. He, Kit Carson, and fellow mountain men Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, along with French trapper Basil Lajeunesse and a handful of Delaware, would set up camp on a creek flowing into Upper Klamath Lake from the west. That's where Lieutenant Gillespie finally caught up with them, bringing their total number to just 14 men. For reasons unknown, and despite being short-handed, Fremont had failed to post a guard that night. I guess he was too preoccupied with the dispatch from Gillespie. Certainly not the best of ideas when you're in an uncertain country. I'm also surprised that Carson didn't push the matter. Nevertheless, shortly after turning in, Kit was jolted awake by the sound of someone bashing in the brains of that Frenchman Basil with a damn battle axe. Carson sounded the alarm as Fremont and the others sprang into action, emptying their guns at the shadowy figures running throughout the camp. After a short battle, they were able to drive off their attackers, but at least 3 of their own lay dead on the ground. Basil and a pair of Delaware scouts known as Crane and Denny. Come sunup, Carson examined the dead natives and decided that they were indeed members of the same band of Klamath they had encountered the day before. And well, let's just say Kit Carson was not a happy camper. In a fit of rage, he took hold of that same short axe that was used to kill his friend Basil and went to work on one of the dead hostiles, raining down blow after blow after blow until finally, according to Fremont, Kit had hacked the warrior's head plumb to pieces. Sort of like that scene from The Patriot when Mel Gibson went to work on that dead redcoat. And although Fremont was planning on heading back to California after receiving that dispatch from Gillespie, he and the boys would now stick around there in Oregon long enough to exact some good old-fashioned revenge. The surviving Delaware scouts were the first to strike. They spotted some natives lurking in the brush and rode off in pursuit, running them down and returning minutes later with a pair of fresh scalps. Carson and some others began traveling along the lake, and in short order they came across a Klamath village, one which they wasted absolutely no time in attacking. Most of the men of the village were out hunting or fishing, so the Americans didn't really meet a whole hell of a lot of resistance. As such, they were able to gun down over 20 of the Klamath fairly quickly. The Delaware scouts killed even more as the survivors attempted to flee for the safety of the forest. Now, Carson would later claim that they did not kill any women or children, but at least one of his party would admit to seeing an old lady lying dead in a canoe. And according to the Klamath, there were several women and children that were killed. And if that ain't bad enough, Carson then had the village burnt to the ground, saying that he wished to do them as much damage as possible. He'd later state that witnessing their homes being reduced to ash was a quote-unquote beautiful sight. You know, I think this goes without saying, but war is hell. Bad things happen, innocent people get caught in the middle, and collateral damage is almost always guaranteed, right? It can be very easy to play Monday morning quarterback with these types of situations, and just as easy to question the actions of men like Carson and Fremont. And to a certain degree, I do think we should question their actions. I think that's part of evolving as humans, just learning from our past victories and defeats. What did we do wrong? What can we improve on? Then again, I'm also fully aware that it's hard to judge people from nearly 200 years ago based on our modern sense of morality. At the end of the day, we weren't there, and we don't know exactly what Carson knew or saw. That said, much like what occurred weeks prior near Lassen's Ranch, there's a very strong chance that these villagers were completely innocent. There's obviously no way to know for sure, but most modern scholars seem to agree that it was the Modoc who were responsible for that initial nighttime attack and not the Klamath. They just had the misfortune of being the first large group of natives that Carson encountered. And really, this just goes back to Carson's time as a mountain man, especially when they were up in Blackfeet country. Whenever he and his fellow fur trappers were attacked, they responded in kind, and they didn't always care whether or not their targets were the guilty party. Now, following this tragedy, as the expedition made its way around the lake, they continued to cut down any and all natives they ran across. Just kept on a-killing till their bloodlust was satisfied. Per John C. Fremont, I had now kept my promise I made to myself and had punished these people well for their treachery. Now I turned my thoughts to the work which they had delayed. In other words, they were headed down to California, and along the way, Kit Carson would have a few close calls. The first incident occurred on the very same day of the massacre. A returning hunter, upon seeing his village destroyed, notched an arrow and aimed it straight at old Kit. Just as he was about to let it fly, here comes Fremont to the rescue, galloping in and trampling the warrior with his horse. The Delaware scout then finished the deed with a war club. Then, as the explorers turned conquerors headed south, yet another warrior rose up from behind a rock and began lobbing off arrows. Per Carson, quote, "He came from his hiding place and commenced firing arrows very rapidly. I dismounted and fired. My shot had its desired effect." Kit then praised the fallen native, saying that he was a brave Indian and that he had deserved a better fate, but had unfortunately placed himself on the wrong path. And I think that's as good a place as any to wrap things up for today. We've got a lot more ground to cover on old Kit Carson, so please join me here next week as we discuss his role in the Bear Flag Revolt, as well as the Mexican-American War and the run-up to the Civil War. Now, if you're the impatient sort or just not a big fan of advertisements, you can always get early access to brand new episodes of the Wild West Extravaganza over at patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Just in case you're not aware, I do post new content there before it goes out to the general public. at least 24 hours in advance. And everything on Patreon is 100% ad-free. No commercials. Not only that, but you can also sleep good at night knowing that 20% of every dollar coming in via Patreon goes straight to charity. Back in April, we were able to donate nearly $300 to Children's International, a global nonprofit that helps kids break the cycle of poverty. And just very recently, last week as of this recording, we donated an additional $284 to the same organization. And that's all thanks to the amazing patrons of the Wild West Extravaganza. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you too would like to support the show while at the same time helping out the less fortunate, once again, that is patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Link down below in the show notes. You may not be aware of this, but I actually did an entire series on Carson years ago, and it was Patreon exclusive. It was also not very good. Matter of fact, a lot of the stuff on Patreon, at least the early stuff that's no longer available to the public, is not very good. So if you'd like to experience a little secondhand embarrassment and hear just how bad I was at this whole podcasting racket back in the early days, now's your chance. Patreon.com/Wild West Extra. All right. Till next time, try not to massacre anybody, okay? Don't go marrying any 14-year-olds. And please, no matter what you do, do not name your kid Archibald. Trust me, he'll just lash out when he gets older and do something stupid like join in the Marines. Till next week, adios.